The old man never thought of himself as someone special. He was 63 years old and had spent most of his life working jobs that nobody really noticed for. The past 11 years he had been a janitor at the Westbrook Community Center every evening. He would arrive just as the sun started to go down. He would push his cleaning cart through the hallways and mop the floors until they shined, would empty the trash cans and wipe down the tables and arrange the chairs in neat rows for the next day. Nobody paid much attention to him. People would walk past him without saying hello. Children would run through the halls he had just cleaned and leave muddy footprints behind. He never complained. He just went back and mopped those floors again. That was his life, and he had made peace with it a long time ago. But there was one thing about him that nobody knew. Late at night, when everyone had gone home and the building was empty and quiet, he would sometimes walk into the storage room at the back of the center. In that room, pushed against the wall and covered with a dusty sheet, was an old upright piano. It was out of tune and some of the keys stuck when you pressed them down. But to him it was the most beautiful instrument in the world. He would sit down on the creaky wooden bench, and he would play not fancy songs, not the kind of music you hear at concerts, just a simple melody, a tune his mother had taught him when he was just a little boy. She had learned it from her own mother, and her mother had learned it from someone before. That it was a song that had been passed down through his family for generations. He did not know its name. He did not know who had written it or where it came from. All he knew was that when he played it, he felt close to his mother again. She had passed away when he was only 13 years old. That was 50 years ago now. But when his fingers touched those piano keys, it felt like she was sitting right there beside him. He would close his eyes, and he could almost smell the lavender soap she used to wear. He could almost hear her humming along in that soft, gentle voice of hers. Melody was simple, just a few notes repeated in a pattern that rose and fell like waves on a quiet shore. But to him, those notes held everything. They held his childhood. They held his mother's love. They held all the memories he was afraid of forgetting. One night, about 3 weeks before the community center's annual talent showcase, he was playing that melody alone in the storage room. He did not realize that the door was open, just a crack. He did not see the woman standing in the hallway listening. Her name was Mrs. Patterson, and she worked at the front desk during the day. She had come back that night because she had forgotten her reading glasses. When she heard the music floating down the hallway, she stopped walking. She stood there for almost 10 minutes just listening. When the music ended, she wiped a tear from her cheek and quietly walked away. The next morning, she found him mopping the lobby floor. She walked up to him and said that she had heard him playing the night before. His face turned red, and he looked down at his mop. He felt embarrassed, like a secret part of him had been exposed. But Mrs. Patterson smiled warmly and told him that it was the most beautiful thing she had heard in a long time. She asked him why he did not sign up for the talent showcase. He shook his head quickly. He told her that he was not a real musician. He said the showcase was for people with actual talent, not for an old janitor who barely knew how to read music. But she would not let it go. Over the next few days, she kept asking him. Other workers at the center joined in too. They had heard about his piano playing through Mrs. Patterson, and they all wanted him to perform. He kept saying no. He felt his hands shake just thinking about standing on a stage in front of people. He had spent his whole life in the background. Idea of being the center of attention terrified him. But something changed one evening. When he was cleaning out the storage room, he moved the old piano to sweep behind it, and a photograph fell out from behind the lid. It was an old black and white picture of his mother sitting at a piano when she was young. He had never seen this photograph before. He did not even know how it had gotten there. Maybe someone had tucked it inside the piano decades ago. Maybe it had been waiting for him to find it all these years. He held the photograph in his trembling hands and stared at her face. She looked so full of life, so full of hope. And in that moment, he made a decision. He would sign up for the showcase, not because he wanted attention, not because he thought he could win, but because he wanted to honor her memory. He wanted to play her song one more time, this time not in a dark storage room alone, but out in the open where the whole world could hear it. The next day, he walked up to the front desk where Mrs. Patterson was sitting. His heart was pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears. He asked for the sign-up sheet in a voice that was barely above a whisper. Mrs. Patterson smiled so wide that her whole face lit up. She handed him the paper and a pen. He looked at the list of names. There were so many of them, young people, talented people, people who had been training their whole lives. He almost put the pen down and walked away, but then he thought of his mother. He thought of that photograph, took a deep breath, and wrote his name at the very bottom of the list. He was the last performer scheduled for the day, the final act of the entire showcase. As he handed the paper back to Mrs. Patterson, she squeezed his hand gently. She told him that he was going to do just fine. He nodded, but deep inside, he was not so sure. That night, he went back to the storage room. He pulled the sheet off the old piano and sat down on the bench. He placed the photograph of his mother on top of the piano where he could see her face, and then he began to practice. He played the melody over and over again, not to make it perfect, but to remember her hands guiding his when he was small, to remember her voice telling him that music was not about being the best. It was about being honest. It was about sharing a piece of your heart with the world. The showcase was 3 weeks away. 3 weeks felt like both a lifetime and a single breath. He kept working his regular shifts during the day, mopping floors, emptying trash, arranging chairs, and every night after everyone went home, he would sit at that old piano and play. Sometimes he would make mistakes, and his fingers would hit the wrong keys, but he did not get frustrated. He just smiled and started again, because his mother had always told him that mistakes were part of learning, that the only real failure was giving up. The days passed. Word spread around the community center. People started looking at him differently, not with pity or indifference like before, but with curiosity, with respect. A few of them even stopped to say hello. In the hallways, one young boy who was about 8 years old asked him if he was really going to play piano at the showcase. He nodded, and the boy grinned. The boy said he could not wait to hear it. That small moment meant more to him than he could ever explain. For the first time in a very long time, he felt like he mattered, like his existence had been noticed, like maybe, just maybe, he had something worth sharing after all. The morning of the showcase arrived faster than he expected. He woke up before the sun came up and lay in bed staring at the ceiling of his small apartment. His stomach felt tight, like someone had tied a knot inside him. Had barely slept the night before. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the auditorium filled with hundreds of faces, all staring at him, waiting for him to fail. He got out of bed and walked to the bathroom. He looked at himself in the mirror. An old man with gray hair and tired eyes looked back at him. He splashed cold water on his face and tried to calm his racing heart. Today was the day. There was no turning back. Now he opened his closet and reached for the only nice shirt he owned. It was a pale blue button-down that had belonged to his father. His father had worn it to church every Sunday for years after his father passed away. He had kept the shirt folded in the back of his closet. He had never worn it himself, but today felt like the right day to finally put it on. The fabric was a little wrinkled, and the collar was slightly faded, but when he buttoned it up and looked in the mirror again, he felt something shift inside him. He felt like his father was there with him, standing beside him, telling him to be brave. He left his apartment and took the bus to the community center. The ride was only 15 minutes, but it felt like hours. He watched the streets go by through the window and tried to keep his breathing steady. When he arrived at the center, his heart nearly stopped. The parking lot was completely full. Cars lined the streets for blocks in every direction. He had never seen so many people at the community center before. Inside the building, the lobby was packed with families and children and performers getting ready. There were teenagers in sparkling costumes carrying violin cases. There was a group of dancers stretching in the corner, their matching outfits bright and colorful. There was a young woman tuning a guitar while her friends cheered her on. Everyone looked so confident, so prepared, so talented. He felt like a fish that had accidentally swum into the wrong ocean. He found a seat in the very back row of the auditorium. The room was huge, with rows and rows of red velvet chairs. A big stage stood at the front with heavy curtains and bright lights. A grand piano sat on one side of the stage. It was black and shiny and looked like it cost more than everything he had ever owned in his life. He swallowed hard. That was the piano he would have to play, not the old beat-up upright in the storage room. This was a real instrument, a professional instrument. What if he touched the keys and no sound came out? What if his fingers forgot the melody? What if everyone laughed at him, shook his head, and tried to push those thoughts away? The showcase began right at noon. The host was a cheerful woman with a loud voice and a big smile. She welcomed everyone and explained that there would be over 20 performances throughout the day. The audience clapped excitedly. The first act was a young boy who could not have been more than 10 years old. He walked onto the stage carrying a violin that looked almost too big for his small body, but when he started to play, the whole room went silent. The music was incredible, fast and complicated, and full of emotion. His fingers moved across the strings like they had been doing this for 100 years. When he finished, the audience erupted into applause. People jumped to their feet. The old man clapped along with everyone else, but inside his chest, his heart sank a little. How could he possibly follow something like that? The next act was a dance group made up of 6 teenage girls. They moved together in perfect sync, their bodies twisting and spinning to a fast beat. The lights flashed different colors and the crowd cheered with every move. When they finished, they struck a pose and the audience went wild. Act after act took the stage. As the afternoon went on, there was a young man who sang a powerful song that made people cry. There was a comedy duo that had the whole room laughing so hard they could barely breathe. There was a magician who made a bird appear out of thin air. There was a little girl who recited a poem she had written herself about her grandmother. Each performance was better than the last. Each one received louder applause than the one before. The old man sat in his seat and watched it all. With every act that passed, his confidence slipped further and further away. These people had real talent. They had trained for years. They had coaches and costumes and backup music. Why did he have just an old melody and a heart full of memories? By the time late afternoon arrived, he could feel the doubt creeping into every corner of his mind. He thought about leaving. He thought about slipping out the back door and going home and pretending he had never signed up. Nobody would notice. Nobody would care. He was just the janitor after all. Then he reached into his pocket and felt the edge of the photograph he had brought it with him, the picture of his mother sitting at the piano all those years ago. He pulled it out and looked at her face. She was smiling in the photograph, a soft, gentle smile that seemed to say everything would be okay. He took a deep breath and put the photograph back in his pocket. He was not going to run. He was going to stay. As the hours passed, the audience started to thin out. Families with young children began to leave. Some people checked their watches and gathered their coats. By early evening, nearly half the seats in the auditorium were empty. The host announced that there were only a few more acts remaining. The old man looked at the program sheet someone had handed him earlier. His name was at the very bottom. The last performance of the entire day. Felt his palms grow sweaty. The act before his was a teenage girl who played the piano. She was incredible. Her fingers flew across the keys, playing a complicated classical piece that filled the entire room. The notes were fast and precise and powerful. People who had been getting ready to leave stopped and turned back to watch. When she finished, she stood up and took a graceful bow. Applause was thunderous. The old man felt his stomach drop. How could he possibly go on after that? She had played something complex and beautiful and impressive. He was going to play a simple melody that a child could learn in an afternoon. The host walked back onto the stage. She thanked the young pianist and then looked down at her list. She squinted at the paper for a moment like she was having trouble reading the last name. Then she announced that there was one final performance. She said his name and gestured toward the back of the auditorium. Few people in the audience turned to look. Most of them did not seem very interested. They were already putting on their jackets and picking up their bags. One man in the middle row yawned loudly. A woman near the front whispered something to her friend, and they both glanced at the exit. The old man stood up slowly. His legs felt weak. His hands were trembling. He walked down the long aisle toward the stage. Each step felt heavier than the last. Auditorium seemed to stretch out forever. He could hear his own footsteps echoing on the floor. When he finally reached the stage, he climbed the 3 small steps and walked toward the grand piano. The lights were bright and hot. He could barely see the faces in the audience. Everything beyond the edge of the stage was just a blur of shadows. He sat down on the piano bench. It was smooth and polished, nothing like the creaky wooden seat in the storage room. He placed his hands on his knees and took a moment to breathe. The room was not silent. People were still talking and shuffling and getting ready to leave. Nobody was really paying attention. He was just the last act, the filler at the end of a long day. He looked down at the piano keys. They were white and perfect and waiting. He reached into his pocket one more time and touched the photograph. Then he closed his eyes. He thought of his mother. He thought of her hands on his when he was small. He thought of her voice humming along to the melody. And with a slow, steady breath, he placed his fingers on the keys and began to play. The first note hung in the air like a single drop of rain falling into a still pond. It was soft and quiet and almost impossible to hear over the noise of the restless audience. People were still chatting and gathering their belongings and checking their phones. A child near the back was asking his mother when they could go home. A group of teenagers near the exit were laughing about something on one of their screens. Nobody was listening. Nobody cared. But he kept playing. The second note followed the first, and then the third and the fourth. The melody began to take shape slowly and gently, like the first light of dawn spreading across a dark sky. His fingers moved across the keys with a tenderness that surprised even himself. This piano was so different from the old one in the storage room. The keys were smooth and responsive, and every note rang out clear and true. He had been afraid that his hands would freeze up, had been terrified that his mind would go blank and he would forget everything. But the moment his fingers touched those keys, something inside him let go. All the fear and doubt and nervousness melted away. There was only the music now. There was only his mother. A woman in the third row had been zipping up her jacket, getting ready to leave. But something made her stop. She stood there with one arm in her sleeve and one arm out, frozen in place. Her eyes drifted toward the stage. She did not know why, but she could not look away. A man near the middle of the auditorium had been scrolling through emails on his phone. His thumb stopped moving. He lowered the phone slowly and lifted his gaze to the old man at the piano. He did not understand what was happening. The music was so simple. Just a handful of notes repeated in a gentle pattern. Nothing fancy, nothing complicated, and yet something about it reached inside him and grabbed hold of his heart. One by one, people began to notice. The chattering faded. The rustling of coats and bags grew quiet. The teenagers near the exit stopped laughing and turned around to watch. Even the child who had been begging to go home fell silent. He sat down on his mother's lap and stared at the stage with wide, curious eyes. The old man did not see any of this. His eyes were closed, and his mind, he was not on a stage in front of strangers. He was back in that tiny apartment from 50 years ago, sitting on a wooden stool next to his mother. She was beside him, her hands warm and soft as she guided his small fingers across the keys. She was humming the melody in that gentle voice of hers. The smell of lavender filled the air. Sunlight streamed through the window and made everything glow. He could feel her presence so strongly that tears began to form behind his closed eyelids. The melody continued to flow from his fingertips. It rose and fell like the breathing of someone lost in a peaceful dream. There were no dramatic crescendos, no thundering chords, no flashy runs up and down the keyboard. Just a simple, honest tune that carried the weight of a lifetime. A woman sitting near the front felt her throat tighten. She did not know this man. She had never seen him before. But something in the way he played reminded her of her own grandmother, a woman who had passed away 3 winters ago. She remembered sitting at her grandmother's feet as a child, listening to old stories and folk songs. She remembered the way her grandmother's hands looked wrinkled and worn, but always so gentle. Without realizing it, she reached up and wiped a tear from her cheek. Across the room, a young man in his 20s leaned forward in his seat. He had come to the showcase to support his younger sister, who had performed earlier in the day. He had been ready to leave an hour ago, but now he sat completely still, his hands clasped together, his eyes fixed on the stage. He thought about his father, a quiet man who worked long hours and never asked for anything in return. A man who showed his love not through words, but through small, steady acts of kindness. This melody reminded him of that quiet kind of love, the kind that does not shout or demand attention, the kind that simply exists like the ground beneath your feet, always there, always holding you up. Old man reached the middle part of the melody. The notes grew slightly softer here, almost like a whisper. This was the part his mother used to call the heart of the song. She told him once that every piece of music has a heart, a moment where everything comes together and speaks directly to the soul. He remembered asking her what that meant when he was just a boy. She had smiled and said that one day he would understand. Now, 50 years later, he finally did. Music was not about being perfect, was not about impressing anyone. It was about being true to yourself, true to the people you love, true to the memories that shape who you are. Man standing near the back of the auditorium had been about to walk out the door. His hand was already on the handle, but something stopped him. He turned around and looked at the stage. He watched the old man playing with his eyes closed and his body swaying ever so slightly. Man let go of the door handle. He walked back into the auditorium and found an empty seat. He sat down and listened. He did not know why, but he felt like he needed to hear how this song ended. The host of the showcase stood off to the side of the stage. She had been checking her notes and preparing to wrap up the event, but now she stood frozen with her clipboard pressed against her chest. Her eyes glistened. She had seen hundreds of performances over the years. She had watched professional musicians and trained dancers and gifted singers, but she had never felt anything quite like this. This was different. This was real. A little girl sitting in the front row tugged on her father's sleeve. She whispered and asked why the music made her feel like crying, even though she was not sad. Her father looked down at her and did not have an answer. He just put his arm around her and pulled her close. The melody began to wind toward its end. The notes grew slower and more deliberate. Each one seemed to hang in the air a moment longer than the last. The old man could feel the song drawing to a close. He did not want it to end. Wanted to stay in this moment forever. He wanted to keep feeling his mother beside him, but he knew that all things must come to an end. That is what makes them precious. He played the final phrase of the melody, 3 notes descending like a gentle sigh, and then one last note, soft and lingering, fading into the silence like the last ember of a dying fire. He held his fingers on the key for a long moment. Then, slowly he lifted his hands and placed them in his lap. He opened his eyes. The stage lights were still bright, and he could not see much beyond the edge of the platform, but he could feel something had changed. The room was completely silent. Not the restless, distracted silence from before. This was something different. This was the silence of 100 hearts all beating together, all feeling the same thing at the same time. He sat there on the piano bench, not sure what to do. He had never performed for anyone before. He did not know if he was supposed to stand up or bow or just walk away. He felt exposed and vulnerable, like he had just shared the most private part of himself with a room full of strangers. and then the silence broke it. Started with a single pair of hands clapping somewhere in the middle of the auditorium, then another pair joined in and another and another. The applause spread across the room like a wave rolling toward the shore. People who had been sitting down rose to their feet. The woman in the third row, who had frozen with her jacket half on, was now clapping with tears streaming down her face. The teenagers near the exit were applauding loudly. The little girl in the front row was clapping her small hands together as fast as she could. The old man looked out at the audience and felt something he had not felt in a very long time. He felt seen. He felt heard. He felt like he mattered, and somewhere deep inside him he knew his mother was smiling. Applause kept going and going. It filled every corner of the auditorium and echoed off the walls. The old man sat on the piano bench. Completely overwhelmed, he did not know what to do with his hands. He did not know where to look. His whole body was shaking, not from fear this time, but from something else, something that felt like relief and disbelief and gratitude all mixed together. He had expected silence. He had expected people to yawn and check their watches and shuffle out the door. He had expected to walk off that stage feeling embarrassed and foolish, but this was the opposite of everything he had imagined. People were standing, people were clapping. Some of them were even crying. He slowly pushed himself up from the piano bench. His legs felt unsteady beneath him. Took a small step forward and gave a tiny nod. It was not a proper bow. He did not know how to do a proper bow. It was just a humble dip of his head, a simple thank you without words. The host walked back onto the stage. Her eyes were red and her voice wavered slightly when she spoke. She said that in all her years of running this showcase, she had never experienced anything quite like that. She turned to the old man and asked him to stay on stage for just a moment longer. He looked confused, but he stayed where he was. Host explained that at the end of every showcase, there was a special award. It was called the Audience Choice Award. Throughout the day, people in the crowd had been given small slips of paper to write down their favorite performance. Volunteers had been collecting those slips and counting them backstage. The host held up a small golden trophy. It was shaped like a musical note, and it glinted under the stage lights. She said that this year the winner was decided by an overwhelming number of votes, more than any other year she could remember, and then she said his name. The old man blinked. He was sure he had misheard. He looked at her, and then at the trophy, and then back at her again. She smiled and held the award out toward him. Audience erupted into another wave of applause. People cheered and whistled. Someone in the back shouted bravo. He reached out with trembling hands and took the trophy. It was heavier than he expected. He held it close to his chest, like it was something precious, like it was something that might disappear if he let go. The host asked if he wanted to say a few words. He opened his mouth, but nothing came out at first. His throat felt tight. He looked out at the sea of faces in front of him, so many strangers, and yet in that moment they did not feel like strangers at all. They felt like family. He cleared his throat and spoke in a voice that was barely above a whisper. He said that he was just a janitor. He said that he had worked at this community center for 11 years, cleaning floors and emptying trash cans. He said that nobody had ever really noticed him before, and that was okay. He had made peace with being invisible a long time ago. But then he paused. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the photograph of his mother. He held it up so the audience could see. Said that this was his mother. He said that she had taught him this melody when he was just a little boy. She passed away when he was 13. For 50 years, he had played this song alone in empty rooms. Never for anyone else, just for her. He said that tonight was the first time he had ever shared it, and he was glad he did, because now her song would live on in the hearts of everyone who heard it. His voice cracked on the last few words. He lowered the photograph and pressed it against his chest right next to the trophy. The audience was silent again, but it was a different kind of silence. It was the silence of deep respect, the silence of shared emotion, That to you? Silence of people who had just witnessed something true. Then the applause began once more, softer this time. More like a warm embrace than a thundering ovation. The old man nodded again and slowly walked off the stage. His legs were still shaky. His heart was still pounding. But there was a lightness in his step that had not been there before. As he made his way down the stairs, a woman approached him. She was the one from the third row, the one who had frozen with her jacket half on. Tears were still wet on her cheeks. She reached out and took his hand in both of hers. She told him that her grandmother used to play piano. She said that listening to him brought back memories she thought she had forgotten. She thanked him and squeezed his hand tightly before walking away before he could catch his breath. Another person came up to him, a young man in his 20s. He said that the song made him think of his father. He said he had not spoken to his father in almost 2 years because of a stupid argument. But tonight, he was going to call him, was going to tell him that he loved him. The old man nodded and patted the young man on the shoulder. He did not have the words to respond, but he did not need them. Sometimes a simple touch says more than 1,000 sentences. More people gathered around him, a mother holding her young daughter by the hand, an elderly couple leaning on each other for support, teenager who looked like he had been trying not to cry. They all wanted to shake his hand. They all wanted to thank him. They all wanted to tell him how the music had made them feel. He stood in the middle of that crowd, feeling like he was dreaming. This could not be real. Things like this did not happen to people like him. He was nobody special. He was just an old man who mopped floors for a living. But here were all these people looking at him like he had given them a gift, looking at him like he had done something that mattered. Mrs. Patterson from the front desk pushed through the crowd. Her face was glowing with pride. She wrapped her arms around him in a tight hug. She whispered in his ear that she knew he could do it. She said she had believed in him from the very first night she heard him playing in that storage room. He hugged her back, and for a moment he could not speak, just held on and let himself feel grateful. When the crowd finally began to thin out, he found a quiet corner of the lobby and sat down on a bench. He placed the trophy beside him and looked at it for a long time. It was real. This whole night was real. He pulled out the photograph of his mother again. He traced his finger along the edge of the old picture. He whispered to her that he did I. That told her that people heard her song. He told her that they loved I. Told her that she would always be remembered. Now a single tear rolled down his cheek, but it was not a sad tear. It was a tear of peace, a tear of completion, a tear that said everything words could not. The auditorium was nearly empty. Now the lights were being turned off one by one. Volunteers were stacking chairs and sweeping the floors. The old man watched them work and smiled to himself. Tomorrow he would be back here doing the same thing, pushing his cleaning cart through the hallways, mopping the floors, emptying the trash cans. But something would be different. He would be different. Because now he knew something he had forgotten long ago. He knew that everyone has something worth sharing. Everyone has a story. Everyone has a song. It does not matter if you are rich or poor, young or old, famous or invisible. What matters is that you have the courage to let your heart be heard. He stood up from the bench and tucked the photograph back into his pocket. He picked up the trophy and held it gently in his hands. Then he walked out of the community center into the cool night air. The stars were out, thousands of them scattered across the dark sky like tiny sparks of hope. He looked up at them and took a deep breath. For the first time in 50 years, he did not feel alone. He felt like his mother was walking right beside him, holding his hand, telling him she was proud, and that was worth more than any trophy in the world. The next morning he woke up and looked at the trophy sitting on his nightstand. For a moment, he thought it had all been a dream, but there it was, golden and real and shining in the early morning light. He reached out and touched it just to make sure it was solid beneath his fingertips. Everything that happened the night before had actually happened. He got out of bed and made himself a cup of tea. He sat by the window of his small apartment and watched the sun rise over the rooftops. The world looked the same as it always did, but he felt different inside, like a door that had been locked for 50 years had finally swung open. He went to work that day just like any other day. He pushed his cleaning cart through the hallways. He mopped the floors and wiped down the tables, but something had changed. People noticed him now. A woman he had never spoken to before stopped him in the hallway and told him she had been at the showcase. She said his performance was the most beautiful thing she had ever heard. A young man who worked in the office upstairs came down just to shake his hand. Said he had watched a video of the performance that someone had posted online. He said it already had thousands of views. The old man did not understand what that meant at first. He did not have a computer. He did not know much about the internet, but Mrs. Patterson explained it to him later that afternoon. She showed him her phone and played the video there. He was on that tiny screen, sitting at the grand piano with his eyes closed, playing his mother's melody. Watched himself and felt a strange mix of emotions, pride and embarrassment and wonder, all swirling together. The comments under the video were filled with kind words. People from all over the world were writing about how the music made them feel. Some said it brought them to tears. Some said it reminded them of someone they had lost. Some said they had watched it 5 times in a row and still could not stop crying. He did not know what to say. He had never imagined that his simple song could reach so many people. Over the next few weeks, his life began to change in ways he never expected. The local newspaper wrote a story about him. A reporter came to the community center and asked him questions about his life and his mother and the melody. He felt awkward talking about himself. He had spent so many years being invisible that being seen felt strange and uncomfortable. But he answered the questions honestly. He told the reporter about growing up poor. He told her about his mother teaching him piano on an old keyboard they found at a thrift store. He told her about losing his mother when he was just a teenager. He told her about the 50 years he spent playing that song alone in empty rooms. The article came out the following Sunday. Was on the front page with a big photograph of him sitting at the piano. People started recognizing him on the street. Strangers would wave and smile. Some would stop and ask for a photograph with him. He did not understand why anyone would want a photograph with an old janitor, but he smiled and stood beside them and let them take their pictures. A few weeks later, something unexpected happened. The director of the community center called him into her office. He was nervous. He thought maybe he had done something wrong. Maybe he had missed a spot while mopping. Maybe someone had complained. But the director was smiling when he walked in. She told him that donations to the community center had increased dramatically since his performance. People had been inspired by his story. They wanted to support the place where he worked. She said they had received enough money to start a new program, a free music class for children who could not afford lessons, and she wanted him to be the teacher. He stared at her in disbelief, told her he was not a real musician. He said he could not read sheet music, said he only knew one song, but she shook her head. She said that what he had was more valuable than technical skill. He had heart, he had soul, he had the ability to make people feel something real. That was what those children needed. Someone who could show them that music was not about being perfect. It was about being honest. He thought about it for a long time. He walked around the community center that night. After everyone had gone home, he ended up in the storage room where the old upright piano still sat against the wall. He pulled off the dusty sheet and sat down on the creaky bench. He placed his fingers on the keys and played his mother's melody one more time as the notes filled the empty room. He thought about what she would want him to do. She'd always believed that music was meant to be shared. She had always said that the greatest gift you can give someone is a piece of your heart. He knew then what his answer would be. First class was held on a Tuesday afternoon. 8 children showed up, ranging in age from 6 to 12. They sat in a half circle around the old upright piano and looked at him with curious eyes. He felt nervous again. just like he had felt on the night of the showcase. But he took a deep breath and introduced himself. He told them he was not a fancy teacher. He told them he did not know all the rules of music, but he promised to teach them the one thing he did know, how to play with feeling, to let the music come from somewhere deep inside. The children listened carefully. Some of them had never touched a piano before. Some of them came from difficult homes where money was tight and dreams felt far away. But in that small room with the afternoon light streaming through the window, they all had the same chance. They all had the same opportunity to discover something beautiful within themselves. He started by teaching them the first few notes of his mother's melody. He showed them how to place their fingers on the keys. He showed them how to press down gently and let the sound ring out. One little girl picked it up faster than the others. She played the notes over and over with a huge smile on her face. A boy who had been shy and quiet at first eventually worked up the courage to try. When he played his first note correctly, his whole face lit up. The old man watched these children and felt something warm spread through his chest. This was why he was still here. This was what his mother had been preparing him for all along. Weeks turned into months. The music program grew more. Children signed up. Other volunteers came forward to help. The community center became a place filled with the sound of pianos and laughter and learning. The old man still worked as a janitor during the mornings. He still mopped the floors and emptied the trash cans, but in the afternoons he was a teacher, was a mentor. He was living proof that it is never too late to find your purpose. One evening after class had ended, he sat alone at the piano in the storage room. The sun was setting outside and golden light poured through the window. He played his mother's melody one more time, but this time something was different. He could hear other melodies mixed in with his own. The sounds of the children practicing in other rooms. The echoes of all the notes they had played that day. His mother's song was no longer his alone. It had grown and spread and taken root in other hearts. He smiled and closed his eyes. He whispered a quiet thank you to his mother wherever she was. Thanked her for teaching him this melody. He thanked her for believing in him even when he did not believe in himself. He thanked her for giving him a gift that he could now pass on to others. When he opened his eyes, he noticed a small figure standing in the doorway. It was the little girl from his class, the one who had learned the melody so quickly. She asked if she could sit beside him. He nodded and made room on the bench. She climbed up and placed her small fingers on the keys together. They played the melody, an old man and a young child. Two generations connected by a simple song. The notes floated out into the evening air and drifted through the open window. They rose up toward the sky where the first stars were beginning to appear, and somewhere out there beyond the clouds and the darkness, a mother was listening. She was smiling. She was proud her song would never be forgotten. It would live on in the hands of children. She would never meet it. Would echo through hallways and homes and hearts for generations to come. That was the real gift, not the trophy, not the applause, not the fame. The real gift was knowing that love never truly dies. It just changes form. It becomes a melody, a memory, a moment shared between two people at a piano, and that is something no amount of time can ever take away.